Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So here I am showing a Viking era, or late Anglo-Saxon era, depending how you look at it, or late Frankish era, sword and shield. And I have spoken at quite some length about shields of this period. Previously we've talked about the size of shields, and we've talked about flat versus lenticular, or essentially domed shields. And there is quite a bit of evidence that not all shields were flat like this, despite the fact that most reenactors, for example, are using flat shields. I strongly believe that the way that that has come about is partly one person copying another, and partly because they're easier to make. Okay, anybody can get a piece of plywood and a boss, and boom, you can make one of these shields pretty easily. But if we actually start looking at the period artwork, then as I've mentioned before, we see quite a bit of evidence for the fact that probably a fair number of shields, at least in Anglo-Saxon England and in what's now France, in Francia, and probably modern Germany, what's now modern Germany as well, were domed and not flat. But I'm not going to go into that topic here. I'm simply going to state one particular thing, and that is there are a lot of people trying to reconstruct Viking era, or this era, kind of early medieval combat, particularly with sword and shield. And there are a couple of things I want to say about that. In fact, three things I want to say. The first thing is, that's great, okay? I'm kind of on the side, one of those people as well. I'm very interested in this topic, and I have devoted some amount of time and some amount of research into trying to get some ideas of maybe how they used these weapons together in this period. But I'm not a specialist in it at all, and people like Roland Wojcicka and other people out there are definitely much more specialised in this stuff. The second thing I want to mention is that how we use the shield can vary quite a lot, and there wasn't necessarily only one way of using the shield in this period. So it is a boss-held shield, that dictates an awful lot. So whether it's a flat shield or a domed lenticular shield, there are some differences, but they are both boss-gripped shields. They're not strapped shields like we see from the Norman period onwards. Okay, so they're gripped in the centre. And that means that you've got several ways of holding the shield. Now, obviously, you can pivot the shield, which Roland talks a lot about, quite rightly so. But the thing that I'm going to focus on here is actually the fact that you can hold the shield either close to the body or far from the body. Now, it's interesting that I would agree, you know, one of the things that Roland picks up on is that one of the advantages of the boss grip shield is you can hold it far from the body, and you have a further reach with this. You can contact the opponent's shield, and in fact the opponent's body as well, from quite a long way away that you can't do with a strapped shield, or you can't do as far with a strapped shield. A strapped shield will generally only come to about here, whereas of course you have about 12 inches or 30 centimetres of reach beyond your fist with a boss grip shield. And that changes a lot because it changes your distance. It changes the distance you can fight at, and you can engage the opponent's weapon or shield at. If you're fighting against someone for a spear, for example, and this is the third point I want to mention, I'll just come onto that briefly in a second. If you're encountering a spear, making contact with the opponent's spear to bind against it is incredibly important. Now, that promised tangent, we have to remember that whilst most reconstructions focus on sword and shield use, almost certainly the most important combo in this period wasn't sword and shield, it was spear and shield. And so for that reason, I've devoted probably as much time to spear and shield as I have to sword and shield. Because let's be frank, even the person, let's be franks, let's be Anglo-Saxons, but let's be straightforward. Even if you're a person who has a sword and who wears a sword, this is not always, but usually the backup weapon. Okay, usually your primary weapon is a spear for a number of reasons. And therefore, if we're looking at combat in this period, we really should be spending a lot of time looking at spear and shield, not just sword and shield. And I think that you have to put these things into context, okay? And the context of sword and shield use in this period will often be not necessarily fighting against someone else with the sword and shield, but fighting against someone else with a spear and shield. Now, I have done a little bit of this in my club, and I have actually found that with this particular type of shield, and any sword, it really doesn't actually matter what type of sword it is, it's a pretty good combo against spear and shield. And I think this is important because if the dominant weapon set in a given period is spear and shield, but a good counter to that might be sword and shield, then that gives you some sense of why the sword was considered so important. But anyway, I'm not going to dwell on that. That's probably a topic to examine in a future video. So coming back to the way that the spear is, the way the shield is held. So we're coming back to sword and shield again. Okay. Now, very clearly, there's many smaller variations. But to me, when I look at shield use in historical artwork, one of the things that strikes me like a sword to the head, is that sometimes we see shields held out, and sometimes we see shields held in, and sometimes we see them kind of somewhere in the middle. Now, what's interesting is if we look at Anglo-Saxon and Frankish art from this period, we see all of these, okay? We sometimes see shields held really close to the body. Let's check the height. So we sometimes see people in guard, what we'd recognise as guard positions. This we'd call garde di alta in Bolognese fencing, for example. Sometimes with the weapon down here with the point forward, sometimes with the weapon held up here, sometimes with the weapon held under the arm, so it'd be a sottobraccio in Bolognese fencing. So we can see recognisable positions that we might recognise from sword and rotella from the 16th century Italian sources, or indeed from sword and buckler sources, which are from all countries all over Europe. And in fact, not just Europe, but sword and buckler sources from across the world, we see very similar positions. There's only, if you have a sword in one hand and a shield or a buckler in the other hand, there are lots of very common positions. An open ward, a point forward position, an over the arm position, an under the arm position, a holding the sword out backward position. These positions we see an awful lot in sword and buckler and sword and shield sources. And as I say, what's interesting when we look at the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon artwork from the period, manuscripts for example, which show people holding swords and shields, we can see some of these positions. But what's interesting is the shield. If we just ignore the sword for a second now, the shield is held in several different positions. Sometimes we see it held very, very close to the body, like in front of the body, like this. And now this is quite popular in my experience with modern reenactors and LARPers. In fact, my friend Mark Gilbert, I know that he prefers to hold a shield quite close to his body. Some people say this is bad, this is wrong, but it is shown in historical artwork, absolutely so. Okay, so there's a very famous Anglo-Saxon manuscript which shows two people fighting with swords and shields, and they both face each other in open ward with their shields held very close to their bodies like this. Okay, so sometimes the artwork shows the shield held, if you were my opponent, like this, very close to the body, or looking to the side, like that. Sometimes it shows it a little bit extended out, okay, or a little bit like that. Okay, so with the arm kind of at a right angle. And sometimes, indeed, it does show, almost like a buckler, the shield held out at full length while fighting's going on. So I think, based on what I can see in the period artwork, we should be looking at these different options. And even if you're reconstructing a system, I believe that any system of reconstructive sword play from this period should feature all of these three. Sometimes here, sometimes here, sometimes here. Okay, and also bear in mind that sometimes if the shield's here, it can be protecting this line. Okay, so if an attack comes in on this side, sometimes you can guard it by doing that. Okay, while simultaneously attacking around that side, for example. We see things like this in later kind of judicial dual shield systems in Talhofer and Palace Cal and things like this. So there could be some implication of that there. But also I would say that it could be that there was regional or system preference. So for example, if we look at, and I've said this before in previous videos, but if we look at sword and buckler systems, whilst there are some commonalities to sword and buckler systems from across Europe during the late medieval and early Renaissance periods, there are also differences. And for example, if we look at Bolognese, so Italian, mid-Italian sword and buckler from the 16th century, it doesn't look very much like 133 or I-33, the Tower Fettbook, which is a German system from the 14th century. Despite the fact they're using very, very similar weapons, they don't use them in the same ways, they don't stand in the same ways. You know, the Bolognese sources are standing more upright, the I-33 system is more extended and lower down. Of course, we see this in longsword systems as well. If we depart from a similar weapon set and we look at longsword, you can see 15th and 16th century longsword systems which have common features and which have different features. And it's equally likely that if we looked at the 9th century, for example, people using swords and shields, that they didn't all use them the same way. It could be that in a certain area they particularly liked keeping the shields close to the body and fighting around, and in another area they really liked keeping the weapon extended out. And this comes back also to the same point that in some areas they probably preferred flat shields. Scandinavia, we know they did. And in other areas, perhaps Francia, for example, they preferred domed shields. And maybe this relates to where and how they held the shields as well. Anyway, some random thoughts to think about there. I've talked about some of these topics before, and I will be talking about some of them again. You may have noticed this is a slightly different sword than the one from this period I normally hold, and I will be talking about this sword as well in future videos. Thanks for watching, and see you for the next video. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.